Hi, welcome to the last chapter on the Catalan. Till now, we had been covering the Catalan setups with C4 included. In this chapter, we'll be checking out the particular move order with 3G3. White is trying to delay playing C4 so that white may exploit some of the move order subtleties. However, due to our repertoire being very consistent and having all the natural moves in the variation, we are not too bothered with these move order subtleties. So, to give an idea, players who play some different variations in Catalan, let's say bishop b4 check, or maybe knight d7, or maybe let's say dc4, bishop g2, bishop b4, they are bothered with this move order because you won't get those variations with this move order. However, if we are playing e6, bishop e7, we can just blindly follow it, and white more or less has to play c4. Otherwise, you don't get a very good position. By the way, if white goes for a second move g3, we are still not bothered, and we'll play the typical knight f6, bishop g2, and e6. We basically transpose this to the previous chapter. White either has to play knight f3 and transpose back to the main line of this chapter, or play some c4 transposing to Catalan. So knight f3, knight f6, g3, and this is the starting point of the chapter. For players who don't want to transpose to our variations in Catalan specifically, they can try to play bishop f5. And this was my initial recommendation for this course as well, because as we have discussed before, I wanted to propose the knight bd7 variation in the main Catalan, which I have now given as the alternative line because, yeah, it couldn't be made to work out objectively. And I had to write this chapter on bishop f5. I basically wrote everything. And after writing everything and just preparing the files before the video, I just realized, why don't I play e6 and transpose with bishop e7? You know? And yeah, if we are playing this bishop e7 variation in the main line in the Catalan, this just seems to be the best option. And yeah, like it was very annoying because you made a complete chapter on bishop f5 and you wrote everything down. I wrote everything. I explained it and all. And after writing the chapter, you just realize, hey, why don't we transpose, right? The point what I want to mention here is like when you're working with engines, you might have some blind spots, and it actually makes a lot of sense just to step out of that and try to think about the positions from a practical point of view. When I got this realization, I was not looking at with an engine. I was just trying to make some moves, try out my human plans, and see how it goes. Anyways, so coming back to the chapter, white probably has to play bishop g2. We go bishop e7. White has nothing better than castling, castle, and here white has maybe two important choices. There is b3, preparing to play c4, and there is bishop f4, which is not too big of a deal, but because JVF played this, Jordan Van Forest, it's worth checking out. There is a sideline with knight bd2, but we just play c5 with knight bd2. White restricts this bishop and doesn't have the option of putting the knight on c3. So if that's not the case, c4 and cd5 won't ever be an issue, and we can just gain space in the center. We are challenging white's pawn. If white plays dc5, which is the strongest move, after bishop c5, c4, and knight c6, we transpose to a variation which we have checked in the previous chapter. And if white plays c3 here, trying to maintain the center, we just play something like cd4, and put our knight on c6. Because this knight is misplaced and the bishop is restricted, our position is very comfortable. And we have two choices here. We can either try to play queen b6, bishop d7, and get all of our pieces in. And then there is an instructive plan where you don't want to play rook a c8, but rather you want to play rook f c8 so that this queen can drop back to d8, and then you play rook a b8, start pushing pawns on the queen side. The idea and the logic behind this is, okay, let me just give you a sample line. Let's say these moves are not going to be played from an opening perspective, but this is just a motif which I wanted to share. And let's say white is doing some random moves. And the reason why we don't play rook a c8 is because we don't know where to put this rook next, right? The rook on f8 is considerably worse than this rook on a8 because it can come to b8 and black is going to play on the queen side. So the rook on b8 is more effective than the rook on f8. When you have to choose between two rooks for competing for one square, it's best to look at the future of the other rook if you play the initial rook to a square and compare which one is more useful on the other rank other square and decide your move. To give an example, to put it in practical terms, compare if this rook comes to c8, compare the position of a8 rook with this rook coming to c8 and the rook on f8. So rook on f8, rook on a8, and imagine both the rooks coming to c8. See which one is more useful. In this case, the rook on a8 is more useful. So put the f rook on c8. Other plan is that this queen is lingering and hindering the progress of b pawn. So with queen on d8, you can gain space on the queen side very easily. Nothing to remember, but just a good motive to know. Also, bishop g5, developing a bishop is not great because we can just play h6, force the white bishop to go back, basically converting to a position which we check next with h6, a extra useful move for us included. Or if white plays bishop f6, we just play bishop f6, and we are very happy to win the bishop pair. We want to play c5 and knight c6 next and put some pressure on the center, the pawn on b2, maybe then get the queen in. And with the pair of bishops, I think it's just black who can be better here. So white's best try is to play bishop f4, the best sideline apart from b3. What is white's point? What white is claiming that if we play c5, challenging the pawn, white can play dc5, and let's say knight c6, c4, bishop into c5, and now white has knight c3. And basically there is some pressure against our center. It's nothing too huge, but there is some nagging pressure. And what white is trying to do is basically white wants us to push c5 and take back with the bishop so that we are in some pressure. And white is claiming that white is delaying c2, c4 for some time. How do we use this? We just play knight bd7. Now we have shut down c2, c4 because if white does that, we just play dc4. And we have a Catalan with our knight on d7, which means we have knight b6 in the air. And if white plays queen c2, trying to win this pawn, we can play knight b6, it's fine. But in fact, knight d5 is just far more stronger. After knight d5, we are now renewing the threat of b5, which was not possible here prior to the threat of knight e5. I'm sorry. Yeah, I have to somehow work on my arrows. Nevertheless, so queen c2, knight d5, we are renewing the threat of playing b5, or we want to play knight f4, win the bishop pair, and after gf4, play c6, shut down this bishop, and then try to get this bishop in, either by breaking through with e5 somehow, or playing a5, a4, gaining space on the queen side. If you remember, we also had a motive of playing queen a5 or rook a5 and playing e5 in one of the previous chapters in a typical position. So queen c4 takes, c6. We want to play a5, a4, and somehow target these pawns, right? Undermine it with c5 possibly, or maybe play bishop d6, knight f6. Just try to get some pieces in. And if you're able to finish your development, you'll have a very good position. All right, let's go. So knight d2, and now because as usual, if the knight is not able to come to c3, we play c5 and challenge the pawn. c3, white is trying to claim that after cd4, white has a slight edge due to the developed pieces. We are somewhat in pressure due to the bishop on c8. But because the knight is on d2, the bishop is on f4, we exploit the poor position of the bishop with knight h5. Now we are trying to win the bishop, and after bishop e3, by the way, it's useful to note that we wanted to play b6, bb7 and finish our development, but white had this very annoying knight e5 with the idea that after bishop b7, there is some c4 ideas. The square on c6 is somewhat weak, and it's not terribly simple for us. White, I mean, the position is equal for sure, but it's just that pushing the bishop back with knight h5 is far more stronger, because after bishop e3, this bishop is misplaced. And after b6, basically we avoid white's activation of pieces with knight e5. And we have a slightly better version of early b6. Our idea is very straightforward. We want to play bb7, and then we want to just play knight somewhere to f6 to e4, maybe bring this knight back and place it on e4. The other ideas could be to gain space on the queen side with a5, a4, and just get our pieces into the game, right? It seems like our pieces are not the best placed, but look at white's pieces. They are even more worse, right? So I teach this concept to my students, which is probably unethical in life, but works properly in chess, which is in life, probably you win by pushing yourself up. Because chess is a zero sum game, that means if my opponent loses, I still win. We also win by pushing our opponent down rather than just uplifting ours, right? So in this position, although our pieces aren't very well placed, our opponent's pieces are even worse. And because of that reason, we are better. Knight e5. Yeah, if white tries to play knight e5, we just have queen c7. And unlike the previous position, white is not exerting pressure on this diagonal. Black is already slightly better due to the extra space. And all you are trying to do here is just develop your pieces and probably continue to gain space on the queen side. And that brings us to the main line with 6b3. So what is white's claim? White wants to play c4, but meet dc4 with b into c4 and maintain those pawns in the center. What do we do for this? Break the center, c5. Now white has two moves. There is bishop b2 and there is d into c5. By the way, one of my good friends, Abhimanyu Puranik, who's a 2600 grandmaster, tried e3, and his point was that after ed4, white wants to play e into d4 and play c4, maintain some space in the center, but we just don't allow that. We can just play b5, and we are threatening to gain more space with c4. At the same time, we are stopping c4 from white. So this just gives us a very comfortable position with the knight jumping in to c6 or to d7, the bishop coming to b7, and we can just play c4 or a5, a4. The main line is bishop b2, but let's just check d into c5, which was played by Magnus and Nihal Sarin. A normal looking move, but completely harmless. We develop one of our pieces, get a piece out, bishop b2. What do? Recapture the pawn and put our bishop on a better square. Now, note that we have somewhat more extra space in the center. So the only way white can actually try to challenge us is by playing c4 and trying to undermine it. Usually we undermine white's center, but here white has to do it, which means our opening problems are all but solved. We just spoil white's pawn structure. If white plays bc4, these pawns are bad, and we can just play queen e7 with the idea of bishop d7, getting the rook out, and then targeting the pawn on c4, probably with knight a5. If white plays queen c2, exploiting that this bishop on c5 is hanging, and we can't play c into b3, we still play queen e7. defend the bishop on c5 with the queen, and after queen c4, we gain space in the center with e5. This opens up the diagonal for our bishop, and as soon as we finish our development with bishop e6 or bishop f5, we stand slightly better due to the extra space. That brings us an end to this variation with d into c5, and we go on to the main line with bishop b2. So what is white trying to claim? White's idea is now white wants to play dc5 and c4, and if we play knight c6, white will probably just play white will play e3, and we transpose to one of the lines which Abhimanyu intended to get, but we have a better response than this. We just play c into d4, knight into d4, and push e5, gain more space in the center. The idea is very straightforward. We just want to roll more pawns, gain further space, and just squeeze the life out of white's position. White has two moves, but the clear main line is knight f3. If white plays knight b5, this is an active response, but unfortunately, it's just that the knight is very poorly placed, and we play knight c6, bring a piece into the game, and all we want to do is just get the c8 bishop out with bishop g4 or bishop f5 and get all of the pieces into the game. We can always kick the knight with a6, and both the knights on the b file, the knight on b5 and the knight on b1, are fighting for the c3 square. So white definitely doesn't have a pleasant position, and in fact the computer goes on to believe that we are very close to having a decisive advantage. A perfect position for us, nothing to worry. So white's main line is knight f3. White forces us to play e4, but then reoccupies the knight on d4, and white's claim is that even though we have gained some space, we have made some weaknesses in the center, and the pawns on e4 and d5 can be undermined. A claim, I'm not saying a good one, but a decent and a reasonable claim. White also has a slight lead in development, so we need to be slightly fast and make some threats of our own. We start off by playing knight c6 and bring a fresh piece into the game. Again, development is of the essence. We want to get as many pieces as quickly as possible. Now white has two moves, the main one being c4, trying to undermine the pawn on d5 and subsequently weaken the pawn on e4. If white plays knight into c6, which looks interesting because after bc6, white has created a weak pawn on c6, but a weakness is only a weakness if it can be exploited. In this position, white can't exploit this weakness. And after c4, bishop e6, we get our last piece into the game. And our idea is very straightforward. We want to play queen d7, connect our rooks, and start harassing the bishop on g2 with h5, h4, alpha 0 style. We'll have plenty of space. White has no targets to attack us, so we remain strategically better due to the extra space. That brings us to the main line with c4. And here I managed to find a great practical novelty, which gives us very good chances. The main lines here are rook e8, knight d4, which are sort of fine, but doesn't give us the a good base to have some complications in the position. White is able to equalize easily and maybe put some very minute pressure. But the move which I found is super interesting. e3. The idea is very simple. We start creating weaknesses on the king side. By the way, it's already a novelty. And we create weaknesses on the king side. White has two moves, f4 or fe3, accepting the pawn but ruining the pawn structure. f4 is possible, but this is a difficult situation for white. Why? Because the pawn on e3 acts as a wedge, disconnecting the queen side with the king side. Chess history buffs would know that there was a very famous Kasparov game with same theme but inverse colors. So maybe you can check that out. And with the pawn on e3, it's like you have a bone sticking into your neck, right? white's pieces are feeling congested. There are not many good squares, and with the pawn on e3, we can always have some threats with knight g4, knight f2, or bishop c5, and it's just very uncomfortable to have that pawn here. We play knight into d4. White has two options, b d4 and queen d4. If white plays b into d4, d into c4, and the only way for white to keep the balance is by sacrificing a pawn for getting all the pieces in, but which is completely fine for us. We have plenty of ways to be fine here. This position is surprisingly fine for white, but let's say bishop e6 and we are never in trouble. We have got all of our pieces in. We have weaknesses to attack to. White can liquidate, but there is nothing more. But if white plays b into c4, which is by far the more logical choice, after knight g4, the threat of knight f2 is very awkward. The only way to somehow not lose material is with queen d3, with the idea to meet knight f2 with queen into e3, and if keeping the bishop on d4 guarded. But after rook e8, now we are threatening knight f2, since queen into e3 is met with bishop f6, and white is already significantly worse. There is no good way to defend the position, and we keep a very healthy advantage. So white probably needs to try queen into d4, but we just played d into c4, and we have a very decent position. If white plays something like queen d8, rook d8, and bc4, recovering the material advantage, we just play bishop g4, and our initiative is far more stronger. We have initiative and we have better pawn structure as well. So everything's in our favor. And if white plays b into c4, we are ready to sacrifice a pawn and play bishop g4. Again, as usual, material is inferior than activity, especially if you are considering about pawns. One pawn, not enough. Activity is by far more important. If white plays queen e3, we play rook c8, threatening bishop c5, king h1, get the last piece into the game, and just by a sheer look at the position, we can tell that black's better due to the activity of our pieces. And that brings us an end to this variation with f4. fe3 is a bit more critical. White has spoiled the pawn structure, but obviously white has an extra pawn, and this pawn on d5 is weak. What do we do here? Start attacking our opponent's weaknesses. Knight g4. Our idea is to play bishop g5, target the weakness on e3, and at the same time have a family fork after knight into e3. White has basically one good move, c into d5. There is bishop d5, which is interesting because knight e3 runs into knight into c6, and rather than us being winning, it's actually white who's winning after queen d4 with a dual threat of queen into g7 and queen into e3. Keeping that in mind, we play knight b4, threatening to win the fork with knight into e3, as well as threatening knight into d5. And even though we are 2 pawns down, if we even recapture the pawn bishop on d5, let's say after queen d2, knight into d5, c into d5, and after something like bishop g5, we just have great initiative. Our rooks coming into the game. These squares are just very weak, and basically there's no good way for white to develop. Maybe let's say white tries knight c2, defending this pawn. We just get a piece out. We want to play rook e8, we want to play queen h6 and attack these weaknesses. White is just busted. There is no good way to defend the position, even if white is 2 pawns up, because the king is so bad, the pawn structure is horrible, and all of black's pieces are flowing into the game. Also note, we have the pair of bishops in an open position. The pair of bishops in open positions are usually just stronger than the knights, and I think it's not too it's not too difficult to judge that bishops are usually stronger than knights, especially if the positions are open. So bishop into d5 is not good. Queen d2 is not good as well. We just get bishop g5 and we are threatening rook e8, but it'll have to lose some material here. Knight into c6 doesn't help white because after bc6, we are threatening bishop c5, bishop g5, knight into e3. We keep all the threats, and at the same time, this pawn on d5 is guarded. So we have less pressure on ourselves. It's a very reasonable position where we are having no problems. That brings us to the main line with c into d5. White accepts the challenge, wins a second pawn, but loses it after knight into e3. What was White's idea? We are threatening knight into f1 and knight into d1, right? Is White losing an exchange? No, because after queen d3, we can't play knight into f1 due to d into c6. The knight is trapped, and White will have two pieces for the rook. Not an exchange, but two pieces, which is a better material combination for White. So, are we lost after queen d3? No, we have knight into d5, winning the pawn back, restoring the material balance. And if we talk about the pawn structure and weaknesses, it's clearly obvious that White's position has a lot more weaknesses and our pawn structure is better. If we are able to finish our development, we'll be better here. So White probably tries to play knight into c6 and we play b into c6. And I think this is a good moment to stop. Our idea is very simple. We want to play bishop e6. We want to play queen b6 check or play bishop c5 check. Try to exploit the weaknesses along this diagonal. And our knight is centralized too. White, on the other hand, has a better pawn structure now because the weakness on c6 is more critical than the pawn on e2. But White has good active bishops. And because of that, White's position is fine. We are not worse, but we are not better either. However, both sides keep chances, but I like black because we are attacking the weaknesses. I have a special place in my heart for positions where I am exerting pressure, and this is one of the positions where I am exerting pressure, right? In general, my philosophy in chess is to put as much pressure as I can because chess is not won by playing accurately. Chess is won by making mistakes, forcing your opponents to make mistakes and then exploiting them. You don't have to play accurately all the time. All you have to do is play better than your opponent, right? And in this position, it's easier to play as black and it's easier to make mistakes as white. All right, that brings us an end to this chapter. To sum it up, basically, we want to stick to the bishop e7 short castle setup. White has two moves here, which we need to be careful about, bishop f4 and b3. If knight d2, just play c5. If bishop f4, we are delaying c5 till the time white doesn't commit to c3 or knight b2. So we play knight d7, knight d2, c5, c3, c5, of course. And c4 is not good because of dc4, queen c2, knight d5. Coming to b3, we want to play c5 as usual. dc5 is not a problem. Knight c6, bishop b2, bishop into c5. We have more space, and if we are able to finish our development, we'll be better. White's critical try is to play c4, trying to undermine our pawn structure in the center, but we just stay. And after queen c2, queen e7, followed by queen c4, e5, getting the bishop out, gaining more space, we have a very comfortable position. If white plays 7th, bishop b2, cd4, knight d4, gaining space with e5, knight f3, e4, knight d4, and white wants to play c4. We first get one of our pieces in, knight c6, c4, and now the very important e3, creating weaknesses in white's position. After fe3, knight g4, we have great compensation. We have all kind of threats in the air. The best way for white is, of course, c into d5, knight e3, queen d3, where we are smart and don't play knight f1, but we play knight d5. All right, that sums up this chapter and this series on Catalan. We now move on to one of the common sidelines between Catalan and the Manhattan, and then I'll see you in the Gukesh QGT chapters.